When Miles Hartford woke up in the hospital after the car accident that should have killed him, the first thing he saw was the nurse checking his vitals, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across monitors that beeped steady rhythms of a heart that had almost stopped beating permanently. The second thing he saw was the necklace hanging against her dark skin, a simple silver chain with a small, engraved compass pendant that caught the fluorescent light and sent fractured reflections across white walls that smelled like antiseptic and second chances. And the third thing he saw, when his vision cleared enough to read the inscription he'd carved himself 23 years ago with a pocket knife and hope that felt foolish even then, were the words, "Find your way home," etched in letters he recognized because they'd come from his own hand. The same necklace he'd given to a 5-year-old girl the day he pulled her from a burning car on Interstate 95 before disappearing into the smoke and chaos, because heroes in movies get recognition and parade coverage. But heroes in real life sometimes just walk away, because staying means watching to see if your Jew was enough or if death claims them anyway. The nurse who'd saved his life was wearing the only proof that he'd once saved hers. Miles Hartford was 47 years old and had spent the last 23 years working as an insurance adjuster, evaluating property damage and calculating risk assessments for a company that paid him well to forget he'd ever been someone who ran toward danger instead of filing reports about it from safe office spaces. But 23 years ago, he'd been a paramedic, first responder to a multi-car pileup on Interstate 95 on a Tuesday afternoon in May, when spring rain had made asphalt slick and one drunk driver had turned a commute into a catastrophe that killed 14 people and destroyed the man Miles had been trying to become. He'd found the car engulfed in flames, parents already dead in the front seat, their bodies burned beyond recognition, beyond saving, beyond any intervention Miles's training had prepared him for. But in the back seat, strapped into a car seat designed to protect children from accidents that weren't supposed to be fatal, was a 5-year-old black girl with braids and a yellow dress covered in butterflies, conscious and screaming with the particular terror of children who understand something is very wrong but can't comprehend that wrong means their parents are dead 3 feet away. Miles had pulled her out with 30 seconds to spare before the gas tank exploded, had felt the heat sear his back as he ran, had collapsed on the highway shoulder with this child in his arms, still screaming for a mama who would never answer again. He'd taken off the necklace he'd worn every day since his own mother died when he was 16, the compass pendant she'd given him the night before cancer took her, the one she'd said would help him find his way back to what mattered when the world got too confusing or too cruel. He'd put it around the little girl's neck, with hands that shook from adrenaline and grief, and the knowledge that he'd saved one child, but couldn't save her parents, couldn't save the 11 other victims whose bodies he'd had to step over to reach her. "This will help you find your way home," he'd told her, trying to make his voice steady when everything inside him was breaking. "Keep it safe. It belonged to someone who always found her way back." Then other paramedics had arrived, had taken the girl to the ambulance, had airlifted her to the trauma center while Miles was pulled back to the wreckage, to the other victims, to the bodies that needed documentation, and the survivors who needed intervention, and the chaos that consumed the next 6 hours until the scene was finally cleared, and Miles went home and didn't sleep for 3 days straight. He'd tried to follow up, had called the hospital asking about a 5-year-old girl from the I-95 accident, but privacy laws meant they couldn't confirm if she'd survived, couldn't tell him if giving away his mother's necklace had meant anything, or if he'd just donated his most precious possession to a child who died anyway from injuries he couldn't see while her parents burned 3 feet away. 6 months later, Miles had quit paramedicine entirely, the PTSD from that day having transformed every emergency call into a reminder that saving one life didn't balance against the 14 he couldn't reach, that heroism was just another word for surviving when other people didn't, and learning to live with that arithmetic. 23 years, and Miles had never stopped wondering. Had she survived? Had she healed? Had his mother's necklace made it through the trauma center, through whatever foster care or family placement, had taken custody of an orphaned 5-year-old, through the decades that turned children into adults who maybe didn't remember the stranger who'd pulled them from fire? 23 years of telling himself it was better not to know, because confirmation of her death would destroy what little peace he'd managed to construct, and confirmation of her survival would mean confronting the fact that he'd saved her, but abandoned her to a system that didn't care, and a future he'd been too broken to ensure was good. Present day brought Miles Hartford to Virginia for work, insurance conference he hadn't wanted to attend, driving rental car through unfamiliar streets when the drunk driver ran the red light at 50 miles per hour and sent Miles's world spinning into metal and glass, and the particular silence that comes before your brain realizes you're dying. Critical condition, they'd told someone. Maybe his emergency contact, maybe just the hospital staff coordinating his care. Multiple injuries, internal bleeding, fractured ribs, collapsed lung, the shopping list of trauma that turns bodies into medical puzzles requiring teams of specialists to solve. When Miles woke up 3 days later in the ICU, his first conscious thought was surprise that he'd woken up at all. His second thought was about the necklace. The nurse leaning over him was young, maybe late 20s, with dark skin that glowed under fluorescent lights, and competent hands that adjusted his IV with the particular efficiency that comes from training reinforced by experience. She smiled when she saw his eyes open, the kind of warm, professional smile nurses learn to deploy that says you're safe now, you're going to be okay, we've got you. But Miles wasn't looking at her smile. He was looking at her necklace, simple silver chain, small compass pendant, catching the light. Impossible. It couldn't be. 23 years, different state, millions of silver necklaces in the world with compass pendants sold in jewelry stores and online shops and flea markets. Except when she leaned closer to check his pupils, when the pendant swung forward close enough for Miles to read the inscription he'd carved with his own hands in his mother's kitchen the week after her funeral, he saw the words that stopped his heart more effectively than the accident had managed. Find your way home. Where did you get that necklace? Miles asked, his voice rough from intubation and days of unconsciousness, the question coming out barely above a whisper, but carrying 23 years of wondering and grief and hope he'd tried to bury under insurance claims and deliberate forgetting. Before we continue, if you believe that some acts of kindness echo across decades in ways we can't predict, subscribe to Love is Kindness. Now tell us, have you ever reconnected with someone who changed your life years ago, or wondered what happened to someone you helped and never saw again? Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. The nurse's hand moved instinctively to the necklace, her fingers finding the compass pendant with the automatic gesture of someone who'd touched the same object thousands of times across 23 years until the motion became unconscious habit, muscle memory encoded so deeply that comfort lived in her fingertips, finding silver metal warmed by her skin. A firefighter gave it to me when I was 5, she said, her voice carrying the particular softness people use when recounting origin stories they've told so many times. The words have worn smooth like river stones. I don't remember much about that day. Just fire and screaming, and then someone carrying me. Strong arms and smoke and feeling safe, even though everything was ending. He put this around my neck and told me it would help me find my way home. Tears formed in Miles's eyes before he could stop them. 23 years of wondering and grief and hope he'd tried to bury under insurance claims, and deliberate forgetting suddenly flooding through damaged ribs and collapsed lungs, and the particular pain that has nothing to do with physical injuries. What else did he say? Miles asked, his voice breaking around words that felt like confession. The nurse looked at him with confusion mixing into concern, probably thinking the medication was making her patient emotional, probably not understanding why this stranger was crying about a story she'd told casually while checking his vitals. He said, she answered slowly, trying to remember exact words spoken by a man she'd never seen clearly through smoke and trauma and the particular fog that settles over memories made when you're 5 years old and your world is ending. Keep it safe. It belonged to someone who always found her way back. Why? Why does that matter? Because I wasn't a firefighter, Miles said, the confession scraping out of his throat like he was pulling shrapnel from old wounds that had never properly healed. I was a paramedic, and that necklace was my mother's. She died when I was 16, gave it to me the night before cancer took her, told me that as long as I wore it, I'd always find my way back to what mattered most. I wore it every day for 7 years until I gave it to a 5-year-old girl I pulled from a burning car because she was screaming for her mama, and her mama was already dead, and I needed her to have something, anything, that meant someone cared whether she survived. The nurse's hands started shaking, her professional composure cracking like ice over water that's been warming from below. Her fingers still touching the necklace, but now with the kind of trembling that comes from foundations shifting, from realities rearranging themselves into configurations that shouldn't be possible, but apparently are. "That's," she stammered, stepping back from his bedside, her dark eyes wide with something between shock and recognition, and the particular devastation that comes from learning that the story you've carried for 23 years has an ending you never imagined. "That's not possible." "May 14th, 2001, Miles said, his voice gaining strength from finally speaking the date he'd been carrying like a stone in his chest for 23 years. "Interstate 95, Virginia. Multiple vehicle collision, 14 fatalities. Drunk driver crossed median during afternoon rain. Your parents' car was on fire. Front seat already gone, nothing I could do for them. But you were in the back, strapped in car seat, alive and screaming. I pulled you out 30 seconds before the gas tank exploded. You were wearing a yellow dress with butterflies." She stepped back further, her hand flying to cover her mouth, and for a moment the professional nurse disappeared entirely, replaced by the 5-year-old child who'd survived impossible fire, who'd lost everything except a stranger's necklace and the fractured memory of being carried to safety by someone whose face she'd never been able to recall clearly enough to describe or find or thank. 23 years of wondering who saved her. 23 years of wearing a stranger's necklace against her skin like a talisman, like proof that miracles existed even when they came wrapped in the worst day of your life. 23 years of being told by her grandmother, by therapists, by well-meaning social workers that she'd survived a miracle, but the details didn't matter as much as the fact that she was alive. "I looked for you," Sienna whispered, tears streaming down her face now, professional boundaries completely abandoned in favor of the truth that had just rearranged her entire understanding of her own history. "For years, I looked, asked everyone. My grandmother tried to find you through the hospital, through emergency services, through every channel she could access, but no one could tell me who pulled me out. The reports just said first responders, no individual names because there were so many people working the scene. I thought maybe I imagined you. Maybe the trauma made me create a guardian angel that didn't actually exist, because my 5-year-old brain needed someone to be the hero in a story where my parents died, and I survived, and nothing about that made sense." Miles's own tears were falling freely now, the kind of crying that comes from wounds opening that had been sealed with scar tissue and time, but never properly cleaned or treated, just covered over and ignored until infection set in, so deep you forgot it was there until something forced it to the surface. "I walked away," he said, the confession carrying 23 years of guilt he'd never properly named or addressed. "Saw too much death that day. 14 people died, and I couldn't save any of them except you. Your parents were already gone, burned beyond recognition, and I pulled you out, but I couldn't give you back what mattered. Couldn't undo the fact that I'd saved your life, but orphaned you in the process. The survivor's guilt destroyed me. Not my survival. Your survival. The fact that I gave you life but couldn't give you family. Couldn't save the people you actually needed." He took a shaking breath, hospital air that smelled like antiseptic and second chances filling lungs that had been collapsed 3 days ago. "I quit paramedicine 6 months later. Couldn't do it anymore. Every call became a reminder that saving one person doesn't balance the equation against everyone you can't reach. I tried to outrun the memories, change careers, moved to Boston, built a completely different life. But I never stopped wondering. Did the girl survive? Did she heal? Did giving away my mother's necklace mean anything? Or did I just donate my most precious possession to a child who died anyway from injuries I couldn't see while her parents burned 3 feet away?" Sienna was crying harder now, her hands wrapped around the necklace like she was afraid it would disappear if she let go, like the last 23 years would evaporate and she'd wake up 5 years old again with no proof that someone had tried to save her from burning. "I lost both my parents that day," she said, her voice thick with Tears and old grief that had never quite healed despite decades of therapy and her grandmother's love, and time's supposedly healing properties. 5 years old, orphaned, raised by my grandmother who did her best but died when I was 19, left me alone again with nothing except memories and this necklace. It became my connection to you, to the man I couldn't find or thank or prove existed outside my fractured memories. She looked up at Miles, meeting his eyes across the hospital bed, two people connected by trauma and silver and impossible coincidence. The necklace made me who I am. Every time I was scared, every time I wanted to give up, every time the world felt too big or too cruel or too indifferent to people like me who'd lost everything before we were old enough to understand what losing everything meant. I touched this compass and remembered that even in the worst moments, someone shows up. Someone cares enough to give you their most precious thing. Someone runs into fire when everyone else is running away. That's why I became a nurse, because someone saved my life, and maybe I could save others. Every patient I help is honoring you. The stranger who gave me a second chance. Miles stared at her. This woman who'd been carrying his mother's necklace for 23 years, who'd built her entire career on the foundation of a rescue he'd thought was failure because he couldn't save everyone, who'd turned his one act of desperate intervention into a life spent helping others. "I live in Boston," he said, his voice rough with emotions he didn't have names for. "I was only in Virginia for work. Insurance conference. That accident shouldn't have happened on that road at that time. I wasn't supposed to be there." Sienna's laugh came out broken, half crying, half disbelief at the impossible mathematics of their reunion. "I grew up in Florida, moved to Virginia for nursing school, started working at this hospital 6 months ago." "What are the odds," she whispered, "that the girl you saved would save you 23 years later in a different state?" Miles shook his head, fresh tears making his vision blur. That the man who gave you his most precious thing would crash in your ICU the 1 week you're covering night shift, the one shift where you'd be his nurse instead of the dozens of other nurses who work this hospital. Sienna touched the necklace again, her fingers finding the inscription that had guided her home for 23 years. That the universe would bring us back together so I could finally say thank you. The question came after a long silence, where they both just stared at each other across the hospital bed, two people connected by silver and fire and 23 years of parallel grief they'd carried alone. "Why didn't you stay?" Sienna asked, her voice carrying the weight of a child who'd spent decades wondering if she'd been worth staying for, if the man who saved her had walked away because she wasn't worth the follow-up, wasn't worth making sure she'd actually survived the rescue. "Why didn't you make sure I was okay?" Miles's voice broke before the words even formed, 23 years of guilt cracking open like a dam that had been holding back floodwaters through sheer force of will and deliberate forgetting. "Because I couldn't watch you die. I'd already seen your parents, already knew I was too late for them, already had their burned faces seared into my memory in ways that still wake me up some nights, even after 2 decades of trying to forget. I pulled you out and gave you my mother's necklace, because if you died too, if I saved you from fire just to lose you to internal injuries or smoke inhalation or the 1,000 ways trauma kills children after the immediate danger is past, I needed you to have something that meant someone tried. That meant someone gave you the most precious thing they had because your life mattered, even if I couldn't guarantee you'd get to keep it." He took a shaking breath, the kind that comes from finally speaking truths that have been rotting inside you for so long they've poisoned everything they touched. "And then they pulled me to another car, another victim, someone else who needed immediate intervention. And by the time I got back to where they'd taken you, you were already gone. Airlifted to trauma center, they said. Critical condition. Wouldn't tell me more because I wasn't family, because privacy laws protect children even when the person asking is the one who pulled them from fire. I tried to follow up, called the hospital every day for a week, but they couldn't give me information, couldn't confirm if you survived, couldn't tell me if giving away my mother's necklace had meant anything or if I'd just donated my most precious possession to a child who died anyway while I was saving someone else. And then I convinced myself it was better not to know, Miles continued, his voice thick with shame that had been building for 23 years. Because if you died, I couldn't live with that. Couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd tried and failed, that my mother's protection hadn't been enough. And if you lived, I'd have to live with the fact that I saved you but couldn't save them, that I gave you life but orphaned you in the process, that maybe saving you at all was cruel, because what kind of life was I giving you? 5 years old with dead parents and a stranger's necklace and trauma that would follow you forever. Sienna's tears were falling freely now, but her voice when she spoke carried something Miles hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, but forgiveness wrapped in understanding that only someone who'd lived through the same kind of survivor's guilt could offer. You think you failed me? You gave me life. You gave me your mother's protection. Do you know how many times I touched this necklace when I was scared? When my grandmother died and I was 19 and suddenly alone again, orphaned twice before I was old enough to vote. When nursing school was too hard and I wanted to quit because organic chemistry didn't make sense and clinical rotations were exhausting, and I kept thinking, maybe I wasn't meant to save people the way you saved me? Every single time I touched this compass and thought, someone saved me for a reason. Someone ran into fire and gave me something precious when I had nothing. I can't waste that. Her voice grew stronger. 23 years of survival and resilience and turning trauma into purpose, giving her words the weight of absolute certainty. You didn't fail me. You gave me the foundation for everything I became. Every patient I've saved, every family I've kept together, every person I've brought back from the edge. That's all because you showed me that one person caring enough to try can change everything. You didn't just save my body. You saved my understanding of what it means to be human. Miles's breakdown was complete now. 23 years of carrying guilt he'd never properly named or addressed, finally collapsing under the weight of hearing that the child he'd saved didn't blame him for the things he couldn't do, only credited him for the one thing he'd managed. I've spent 23 years wondering if saving you mattered, he said through tears that felt like they'd been building pressure behind his eyes since 2001. If the one life I pulled from fire was enough to balance the 14 I couldn't reach. My therapist said I had survivor's guilt, but it was worse than that. It was savior's guilt. I saved one child, and it destroyed me because I couldn't save everyone. Because your survival meant someone else's death. Because the time I spent pulling you out was time I couldn't spend reaching someone else who died while I was being your hero. Sienna moved closer to the bed, her professional distance completely abandoned, her hand reaching out to take his in the kind of gesture that crossed every boundary between nurse and patient, because some moments required human connection more than professional protocol. You couldn't save everyone, she said, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd spent years thinking through the same equations from the other side. But you saved me, and I've spent 23 years saving others because of you. Do you know how many patients I've brought back from the edge? How many families I've kept together because I learned how to be calm in crisis, how to give people hope when everything looks hopeless, how to show up even when showing up is terrifying. She squeezed his hand, her fingers warm against his palm. You didn't just save one life. You saved all the lives I've saved since. That's not failure, Miles. That's legacy. That's one act of courage rippling out across decades in ways you couldn't possibly predict or measure. You gave me your mother's necklace and told me it would help me find my way home. And it did. It guided me to nursing school, to trauma care, to every patient who needed someone to show up the way you showed up for me. That's not one life. That's hundreds. Sienna's hands moved slowly to the back of her neck, finding the clasp of the necklace she'd worn every single day for 23 years, through childhood and adolescence and nursing school, and first jobs and every moment in between. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened it for the first time since Miles had put it around her neck when she was 5 years old, and her world was ending. No, Miles said immediately, panic entering his voice. You keep it. It's yours. It's been yours for 23 years. Sienna shook her head, the necklace pooling in her palm like liquid silver, the compass pendant catching fluorescent light the same way it had caught firelight 2 decades ago. It was borrowed, she said softly. I've been keeping it safe until I could return it to the person who needed to know it mattered. She placed it carefully in Miles's hand, her fingers curling his around the silver chain that had connected them across 23 years and 3 states. An impossible coincidence. Your mother gave this to you so you'd find your way back to what matters. You gave it to me so I'd survive long enough to give it back. We both found our way home. Miles stared at the necklace in his palm, the weight of it familiar even after 23 years, his mother's inscription still legible, despite decades of being worn against a child's skin while she grew into a woman who saved lives for a living. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sienna smiled through her tears, the kind of smile that carried hope and healing, and the understanding that some endings are actually beginnings disguised. "Now you heal. I'll be your nurse. And when you're ready, when you've recovered enough to talk without machines monitoring every breath, maybe you'll tell me more about your mother. About the woman who raised someone brave enough to run into fire when everyone else was running away." "She'd have liked you," Miles said, a small smile breaking through grief that had been holding his face hostage for 23 years. "She always said we're meant to pass on what we're given, that gifts aren't meant to be hoarded but shared, that love only matters if you give it away. I thought giving away her necklace meant I'd lost the only piece of her I had left. Turns out I was investing it in someone who'd multiply it across decades in ways she would have loved." 3 months later, Miles Hartford returned to the hospital, not as a patient with critical injuries and collapsed lungs, but as a volunteer who'd finally found a way to face the trauma that had destroyed his career and consumed 2 decades of his life. He worked with trauma survivors, helping them process the particular guilt that comes from surviving when others didn't, from being saved when rescue feels like failure because the people who actually mattered are gone. Sienna was his first call when he had questions about patient care or crisis intervention, or how to talk to people who'd lost everything except the breath in their lungs. They met for coffee once a week, sometimes to discuss cases, sometimes just to sit in comfortable silence that came from sharing a history too complex for casual conversation. The necklace sat between them on Sienna's coffee table during these meetings, no longer worn by either of them, but displayed in a small frame alongside a photograph Sienna had kept for 23 years. 5-year-old Sienna in a hospital bed, bandaged and small and alive, taken the day after Miles had pulled her from fire. He'd never seen it before, never knew she'd survived long enough for photos, never knew that the child he'd saved had grown into this woman who turned his one act of desperate intervention into a career of saving others. Miles attended his first support group for first responders with PTSD on a Thursday evening in September, 3 months after the drunk driver had crashed him into Sienna's ICU, and 23 years after Interstate 95 had destroyed the paramedic he'd been trying to become. Sienna came with him, her idea, her insistence that healing wasn't something you did alone, but something you did together with people who understood what you'd survived. The group leader asked Miles to share his story, and for the first time in 23 years, he spoke the full truth, without editing or minimizing or trying to make it hurt less than it did. "I thought I failed," Miles said, his voice steady now in ways it hadn't been when he'd woken up to find Sienna wearing his mother's necklace. "I saved one child and lost 14 people and spent 23 years believing that made me a failure, that the math didn't balance, that one life saved couldn't possibly justify all the lives I couldn't reach. Turns out, I just couldn't see far enough to know what saving one life actually meant." Sienna added her voice to his, speaking to the room full of first responders who carried their own impossible arithmetic. "He saved me. I saved him." That's how healing works. We don't save people once and walk away. We save each other repeatedly across decades in ways we can't predict or control. One act of courage echoes forward in time through every person that survivor touches, every life they save, every moment they choose to show up because someone once showed up for them. Miles Hartford gave away the only thing his mother left him to save a child he'd never see again. Sienna Brooks wore a stranger's necklace for 23 years, waiting to say thank you. And when a drunk driver's mistake brought them to the same hospital room 2 decades later, they discovered that some debts aren't meant to be repaid. They're meant to be passed forward, One necklace, 2 lives, 23 years, and the understanding that heroes don't always know they're heroes until the people they saved become the ones doing the saving. That legacy isn't measured in the moment, but in the decades that follow. That giving away your most precious thing to someone who needs it more isn't loss, but investment. And that sometimes, if you're very lucky, the universe brings you full circle so you can finally understand that the worst day of your life, the day you thought you failed everyone who mattered, was actually the day you changed the world for one person who'd spend the next 23 years changing it for hundreds more. We never know how far our kindness travels or whose life we change with simple acts we think don't matter enough. Have you ever reconnected with someone who changed your life years ago, or discovered that something you did without thinking became someone else's turning point? Comment below, tell us where you're watching from, and rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes the people we save don't just survive. They become the ones who save us back when we need it most.